I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. And as the preference for this video, let me start out by giving a background to what led me to this. Several months ago, I was posed a topic and a question by a viewer and another YouTube vlogger named Too Weird to Normal on the topic of the question of aesthetic taste or artistic taste in context or in respects to one's personality. So do certain personality types have certain tendencies and their taste towards aesthetics or art? And oftentimes, as happens in the scope of contemplation and investigation that I do on a topic, I tend to find much richer information and scopes of questions. And this question and this topic led me to think of aesthetics in general as a subject and as a matter of philosophy, but I found that to be quite complex and even convoluted in some scopes, and not easy to delineate, as many philosophers have tried in the past to describe what is aesthetics. But that led me to an even more richer question on what is art, essentially. And I investigated the philosophy of art, and the reason I find that in the past I have veered away from these things is because it is quite hard to pin down and demarcate and delineate stringently what things are and what they stand for. And very rarely, when I went and reached for this and tried to uproot it, I found a root system and infrastructure underneath the very topic itself so deep and interconnected to the multifarious pieces of perception, evolutionary history, anthropomorphic things, too much per se. It was too rich and too diversified and insidious in its rooting properties per se, and that is art. However, I then learned that I should change my approach of analyses per se and treat art like I treat nature and other phenomenon as a self-organizing system, to where I stopped looking for definite what is patterns or demarcative aspects and started looking for general trends and makeups and started asking phenomenological questions and metaphysical questions per se. And I have been mulling over these things, and some of these central properties and tendencies to what I've observed has come out implicitly in other videos when I've talked about creativity or the burden of creativity in one video. And I would like to talk about art all on its own as a mode of expression and as a mode of the collective agencies that constitute some aspects of human cognition and what it is that we are motivated to do in an environment and with information. So with that said, this is on art. The place I would like to start is that art has an interesting history in a very linear way per se. It is not quite this linear, but one can think of it as this. When one looks at the artwork of children, one is seeing not necessarily representation, but an abstraction of a collection of phenomenon. So, for example, you have, when children draw people, they draw stick figures. If they draw hands, they draw lines or line segments of 3s and 4 nodes connecting to one another in sort of a tree branch manner, and they ascribe that as a hand, or even 5 if they're trying to be very detailed. but they're not at all a representation of the very bizarre digitation and fleshly nature of hands. It seems that what children do per se in art is take and make an aggregation of relevant items that give them the ability to make an abstract representation and make a classification system of sets of things that this thing has, or invariant and definite properties that make a thing a thing. And you can see it in houses, and it's very, when psychologists and cognitive scientists try to come at why and how we make classes for things, it is a very rather messy process and hard to delineate and separate and parsimony into relevant categories per se, or ones that have distinct properties to them that don't blur in some manner and where the lines get fuzzy. But it is that when one looks at how children make houses per se, is that they make a general box, a rectangle or a triangle of some sort, and then place a rectangle or a square of some sort, and then place a triangle at the top, though no real house looks like that. And they give it window panes and doors, and a door essentially as its decorative features. But houses are essentially containment units that have windows on them and that have doors. Sunlight gets into them, they shelter us with roofing, and they have 4x4 paneling in some respects. And it's not quite obvious to how we decide that's what a house is and what it should be, but that is representation. So art stems from that. That is not art in of itself, but it is impressionism, delineation, and abstraction, which is something that finds itself in the root of art and is expressed throughout the entirety of it. It's a ubiquitous thing. Therefore, there's this tendency for hieroglyphics and other pictographic images to be considered art, though in the way that I'm going to be talking about art, that isn't necessarily art. But the thing that it does show is that the thing about art is that it is passively representative. It is not necessarily actively representative, but it is passively representative. And whether or not art is actively or passively representative makes the distinctions between the category of realism and impressionistic art per se. Though I think impressionistic art is more is older and realer than realism, as it took the Renaissance and certain figures like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and different artists to actually make an entire school and way of doing things. It's like a historical aggregation per se, but very really this is the kind of, I can make a rough dichotomy between the two camps like this. And what it tells us about art per se, and the way that it is representative by way of the process of abstraction per se, is that art does not, or the human mind does not necessarily take what's in the environment and reproduce it or reconstruct it exactly like it is. Autistic people do that. And if you listen to Temple Grandin and her talks per se, she's a very brilliant woman who is into animal husbandry and things, but was born severely autistic. And essentially what she describes autism as is a deficit in imagination. And it is autistic people, the farther you get on the autistic spectrum, the greater the loading of working memory and the greater the tendency to specification. So very specific in the now phenomenon. If you tell an autistic person something about a house, they think of a house that they've been in, and that will be their representation. To where in very real forms in impressionisticism and even realism in some respect, it is not exact, but an abstraction or a collection, a summation of experiences being compacted into one thing, the generation of archetypes per se, and that's what's presented in art. And so art is something that is generative, archetypal in nature, and where the reason we find the representations, or at least the reason that psychologists, depth psychologists, find such deep and primordial representations of human nature and what's anthropomorphically relevant, per se, to our subconscious and many other mythopoetic, romantic, and even religious motifs and phenomenon emerge, per se, but they have their prominence in art because of this aspect of art, it being very abstract in nature and being bimodal in terms of it can be passively or actively representing something. But what supersedes this whole frontier is the item of perspective. So perspective and perspectives is the whole point and the why for art. When art said that art should exist for art's sake and not necessarily political sake or religious sake or even realism or correspondence representative capacities, what it was saying is that art is looking to look at things in a different way. This is why creativity is highly linked and associated with artistry and media and artistic forms of media and music and literature and paintings and sculptures and whatnot, but also why art can seem to be even abstracted in even a greater meta sense and be a synthesizing or consistent strand of agency or metaphysical notion that can be within any subject matter given the individuals and necessarily what it is they do with perspectives within the field, and where Thomas Kuhn, even in his talk, The Philosopher of Science, in his talk of Scientific Revolutions, talked about the idea of paradigm shifts, seeing the world in a totally different and radical way. That is the reason, that is the job, that is the nature of art. Looking at the world in different ways, and they have a very specific name for this, and it's perspectives. And perspective is a very, very fundamental piece to what makes art art, and how it has its connectivity to abstraction per se, because no house looks like a house that a child draws, but because they pull out very distinct and invariant characteristics of it per se in terms of making decisions by way of functionality, essentially, in objectivity, what actually exists and what do we use it for, basically, they can come up with something that we can say, well, it's a house depending on how you look at it. You can play this mental game with yourself and saying, how should we look at this to see it as something that is in the world but may not necessarily have that immediate shape and form. And this is what art is doing, and it has consistently done. Now, the reason that I think that art is not decorative is because the idea of a mere decorative, this is why art is not in service to anything or a servant of anything, but is very much the other side of rational agency, as in not all irrational elements are art or are like art, but the intuitive, the numinous, and the abstracting agencies that exist in human cognition are within the mode and systems that we use to make profound and beautiful artwork. But I find that those things are very much connected in some sense and almost inseparable to the stringent codification of things, rationality, demarcation. They're like twin brothers in some respects, being of the same cloth but of different qualities. They are essentially trying to do the same things but go at it fundamentally different. I guess that's why I do not necessarily have a problem with intuition, and introverted feeling. I biasly have a problem with extroverted feeling at times because I repress it. But I don't have a problem with introverted feeling in the way like a lot of people do. I don't have a problem with intuition in the way that a lot of I find other heavily rationally centric, particularly STs and SJs can have STs really and SJs can have towards things like that. But anyways, I'm digressing. This is not about types, but as art in general, and it's to say that this tendency to try and change the perspectives and shift the way we look at something, one does not know what they will find when they go out, explore, or rotate an object, because there is an objective sense to things. You can take an object and say, how many ways can I turn it? You can take a concept and you say, how many ways I can turn it, how many ways can I turn it on its head? But these things have finite capacities to them, and they have dimensions, so they will, in a sense, they may give a large number of possibilities in which that can emerge from them, but they're not an infinite number of possibilities. And amongst those possibilities or possible worlds in which that they can reveal, some of them may not be what we anticipated or what we expected. Some of them may be awe-inspiring or numinous or so deep because these things are emerging from the human mind and the complex of the self-organizing organ of the brain, the complex of neurological tissues that is at the helm of our existence. These things are emerging from it. So art very really is dangerous and can be dangerous per se, because it has something of its nature that exists out even in the aesthetically pleasing context, and to where in real art you find what is aesthetically pleasing, absurd, and numinous all existing together in one space. That's at least in profound art. It's what's pleasing and what's familiar also, but what is horrific, absurd, and paradoxical, and numinous. Though people tend to conflate what's numinous or what's awe-inspiring with the absurd and paradoxical, and I don't like that, because what's numinous is what's beyond human capacity. What's absurd and paradoxical is because of our makeup as people, and people would say that those are the same things, but they're not necessarily the same things, because what's absurd wouldn't exist without us, and what's numinous would exist even if we weren't here. We just perceive it as such because we are human beings per se, and that's the way that I see it. And all those elements exist together per se, and it's why art is the activity of exploration of perspectives. It is trying to explore and push the boundaries of what can be seen, known, and represented within about a subject, within the lexicon of the human experience, and what can be known about anything at any one time or place, space, or point, or even about concepts such as space and points in of themselves when you get to postmodernistic art per se. And I'm not a fan of postmodernistic art necessarily, but I do recognize this general tendency and vein in it, and it is to say that art is very much the agency or the ethos, the spirit, if you will, of expanding boundaries. It is always expanding boundaries and frontiers. It is in some ways asking, in the sort of commercial art and the appraisal of art, there is a secondary question placed on it to what is aesthetically pleasing, and ultimately what is useful to the it seems like what is aesthetically pleasing has its utility in the therapy of the mind, and this is why there are such fields as music therapy or art therapy,
because it seems like the utility that art has. There is a very interesting quote that I think I made it up, but I don't know because I said it when I was 6 years old. So I could have heard somebody else say it, but I said that genius is when man sees himself, and or when woman sees herself, whatever, in our age of gender sensitivity. But it is when whatever is sentient and aware and conscious of its experience, the good and the horrific parts of it, sees that thing represented in the world as something completely different from it qualitatively in many ways, but exactly like it. It's when we have that mirroring phenomenon per se that it has this sort of transformative ability to be a therapeutic agent with us because it's real and not real at the same time. And that's so interesting and something very weird and strange about our cognition. And people find it laughable when I say this, and when I make debates and with people in my physics lab per se. But I have a category for real things that are real, a set of real things that are real, and a set of non-real things that are real. Art is that thing that is non-real, but it is real. That it's because it has that, it can exist in that space, that it can be something that extends, rejuvenates, and revivifies the individual and helps them put together and reconstruct or assimilate trauma and package it off and do different things, because the thing that art does is take you outside of yourself in some respects and widen your horizons and help you see things in a different way. And it is in some ways coming in contact with the numinous. It is almost like a religious experience or a spiritual experience, and why some people say that their religion is art, or that their spirituality, the spirituality that they practice, is creativity and art. I think a lot of times in the spirituality I practice is creativity, and I get most of anything that constitutes what's spiritual or numinous that I pay attention to from humanistic tendencies per se, and what's greater and older in nature, and from the revelatory aspects of intuition and the creative experience, particularly, and the very exhilarating and traumatizing and taxing flow state. And it's just to say that art is such an interesting communicative form per se, because that is art's mode of existence, is communication. It is telling us things or showing or revealing things to us per se, and that is the mode of art, just as the mode of science is to explain the world. Science has to explain the world through shifting perspectives and representing things. Art does the same thing. It's very weird and interesting like this, but it's because they both are inventions of the human mind, and that the construction of knowledge and the extension of what we know per se is housed essentially in the same system near one another in the brain, that these things have this dovetailing symmetry with one another per se, and art will always be the exploration of what we see, know, and understand and can represent about the world. And I find that so fascinating and interesting. Also, in terms of personalities per se, I will say this, that as a personality, I am aesthetically sensitive and aesthetically explorative. I'm not aesthetically appreciative. I find that these are the two rough dichotomies to where I think SJs and SPs and NFs can be aesthetically appreciative, as in the qualitative elements that an art piece has appeals to them. Aesthetic sensitivity is that you may not find an appraisal value structure for what that piece ought to stand for in its place in your life, but it does move you in an emotional way. And aesthetic exploration is something that is going to be far more in SPs, NFs, and NTs as in we are looking to see what else can be drawn from something and what else can be represented, and we're looking to push the boundaries and be explorers per se, and aesthetic astronauts in some ways. One great step for the aesthetic world is one great step in the aesthetic world is one large leap for mankind, and its present understanding about the world, because now everybody has been trained by the Impressionists, in a sense, to look impressionistically at the world in some respects, and we had not before, though I think some elements of Impressionism is older than realism per se, like in cave paintings and things like that. But anyways, it's just to say that art teaches the individual how to see, and there is this interesting connection, and it's particularly in Christian theology, between seeing and knowing the truth and life. And art is this life-generative thing and life-bringing thing because it revivifies the world and helps us see in a new way so that we may maintain and preserve ourselves in some respect of the subjectivity of things, as well as even being the shadow and the underlying architecture for the restructuring of hypotheses and the fundamental intuitive roots of the rational and scientific processing of experiences and information. So that is my take on art, and what I wanted to share in this video, and hopefully you found it interesting. But yeah, I like art, so thank you for watching.